This morning we're going to try to tackle 1 Samuel 15. John, thank you. So 1 Samuel 15 is really decisive in the whole narrative of 1 Samuel. In 15 we get the decisive rejection of Saul as king over Israel, and we want to pay close attention to the reason for the rejection. So let's pick it up. We'll take a look, first of all, at 15, 1 through 16. That's the first sort of unit. So here it is. And we want to there's a lot of intricacy here, so we want to pay close attention to it. And Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now, therefore, listen to the words of the Lord," which Samuel's about to deliver. "Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted that Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man, woman, child, and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So Saul summoned the people and numbered them at Telaim, 200,000 men on foot and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. When Saul said to the Kenites, "Go down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you have showed kindness to all the people of Israel when they came up out of Egypt." So the Kenites departed among the Amalekites, and Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatted calves and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. The word of the Lord came to Samuel, "I regret that I have made Saul king." That's a really important part, right? "For he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments." And Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all night. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning, and it was told Samuel, "Saul, come to Carmel." And behold, he set up a monument for himself, and turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed be you, the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." And Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears, and the lowing of oxen that I hear?" Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord our God, and the rest we have devoted to destruction." Then Samuel said to Saul, "Stop, I will tell you what the Lord said to me this night." And he said to him, "Speak." So let's take a look at what's happening here, because as I said, it's really important. So a couple things to notice here. First, notice that even though he's king, Saul is still accountable to Samuel, the judge prophet. It's a really important pattern that we'll see running throughout the Old Testament. That is, no matter who the king is, as a king, you're still accountable, right? There's a structure of accountability. You can't just do anything you want. And so Saul here is accountable to Samuel, who delivers the Lord's instructions and then calls one into account if they haven't been kept, which is certainly the case here. And I think what Samuel says is really significant. He says, "Therefore, listen to the word of the Lord your God." Now, I think this word "listen" here is really, really important. It's not just, yeah, got it, that's really interesting, and on he goes, right? This is almost like from Deuteronomy 6:3, right? "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." That is, the hearing that's supposed to take place here isn't just a mental hearing or a, "yeah, that's nice" hearing, or "yeah, I understood what you said." But it's sort of like a hearing that involves absorbing what's being said, taking it into kind of like your very soul. and then living into it. And notice, this is really important, notice here, Saul, even as king, right, is not given the freedom to sort of offer his own interpretation of what's being said here, right? Saul's not being told, okay, well, here's what the Lord says. Now, you sort of add your own interpretation in this and then kind of act accordingly. No, that's kind of removed from the beginning. Now, what Samuel tells Saul is this, that he's to go and utterly destroy the people of Amalek, the Amalekites. And you may remember many, many moons ago that back in Exodus 17, remember as they were on their way to the promised land and as they were heading toward that land, right? Remember the Amalekites attacked them on the way. So God's now remembering this and telling the people of Israel to now go utterly destroy the people of Amalek. Now, there's something going on here that we want to note here. Actually, two things. Thing number one, this command actually has nothing to do whatsoever with Israel's most pressing problem, which are the Philistines. That's the real problem at this moment, right? It's the encroachments of the Philistines. That's a really big concern. Saul's been dealing with that since he became king. And now God's actually laying upon Saul, undertaking a battle which actually contributes to that effort not at all. Which automatically tells us, right, there's something else going on here. This is a test of obedience. It figures in no way, shape, or form to sort of Israel's larger battle strategy. It's something completely outside that. The other thing here, and we've talked about this before when we looked at the book of Joshua, this phrase, utterly destroy. As I've noted before, it's a translation of this kind of almost untranslatable Hebrew word, herem. Sometimes people will translate herem as holy war. I think that's a mistake because the translation is already sort of an interpretation that is, herem really isn't a kind of warfare in the way that we think of it. And that's a really important distinction to make. Remember, herem is where a people is like completely destroyed along with everything else, right? Cities, livestock, the whole 9 yards. They're completely wiped out for a very specific reason. Herem is directed toward people who are regarded as sort of like impurities. It has nothing to do with like military victory or conquest. And that's the really important point. That's why I don't think we should refer to it as holy war. It's herem, utterly destroy, remove an impurity. That's what Saul's being told to do here. And so Saul sets out to do this. He summons the people together, and it looks like they're going to engage in this sort of herem. Only that's not how things turn out. So it's really important to know what does turn out. Notice what happens here. Saul does kind of get rid of all the Amalekite people, but he makes two acts of interpretation on the divine command. First, he spares the king of the Amalekites, Agag, and he also spares all the best livestock, which he wasn't supposed to do. And it's important to note his rationale for this here. Notice what this is 15:9. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatted calves and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy. That is, the command to enact herem is not fulfilled here. All that was despised and worthless, they devoted to destruction. So notice what's going on here. They keep the best livestock, and they decide to devote to destruction basically what they don't like. That's kind of what's going on here. By way of, and this sort of allows, well, yeah, we carried out the command, and we destroyed something. That's all that really counts. Well, no, that's really not what counts at all. And then God says this to Samuel in 15:10. the word of the Lord came to Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my command. So two things about that phrase that we want to kind of think about. Turn back from following. That's a really important phrase, and I want to dwell on it for just a minute because you may remember, right, this is the phrase that gets repeated over and over in Deuteronomy, right? Remember, there's this constant warning not to turn back from following the commandments that I've given you. And it's a really important phrase, right, because it suggests what's happening, right? Turn back from following, right? Not just like omit, not just sort of maybe not quite do, but turn back from following. Turn your back from following. God here says this is exactly what Saul the king has done. He's turned back from following the commandments of God. In effect, right, that's rejection. When you turn your back on God and you decide, well, hey, I like, looking at the following, 5 commandments you just given me, I like the first 2, I don't like the last 3, so I've decided, to omit them, or something like that. Many years ago, there was a cartoon in a journal called Christian Leadership. It was a series of cartoons where there were 2 churches that were right next to one another, and they were kind of like competing against one another. And the one church was like larger, the other church was clearly smaller. And so the one church in one of the series has decided to really try to like lure people in. And so they have on their sign, such and such church, and it says, home of the 8 commandments, and then in parentheses it says, your choice. And then the final series, in the final series of the cartoon, the one church is like this big Gothic structure, and the smaller church is like this little colonial building, and it has the little colonial building with the sign that says, half the size, twice as righteous. But anyway, Saul here turns back from following the commandments of God, and therefore he's rejected as king. So notice what's going on here. Once again, we're seeing something really important. We're seeing that the office of king is just that. It's an office. It's not something that anyone has like the inherent right to. It's not like once you become king, that's it for life. You're just sort of there and you do whatever you want. Rather, you are accountable. And the chief sort of measure of accountability is faithfulness to the covenant. And Saul doesn't measure up, and now he's been rejected. And what we'll find out here is the rest of the book of 1 Samuel is going to be the long, drawn-out story of Saul's basically diminishment and finally the end of his reign. That's how the whole book is going to turn out, because he's done that. The other thing I just want to notice here, right, is God says that he regrets. Now that's an interesting phrase, right? And we probably need to sort of understand this word regret in a sort of analogical way, right? Because God's knowledge, right, isn't like progressive. That is, God's not like us. He doesn't know things in a time stream. Thing 1, thing 2, thing 3, thing 4, thing 5, right? Because of the divine knowledge, right, God knows everything at once. And therefore, it's not like, he's now looking back and thinking, oh, that was a bad choice. What was I thinking when I chose Saul? Maybe it was like, it was like a divine senior moment or something like that. Rather, and as I said, I think we need to see this as not God looking back and regretting a decision which he made in his own wisdom, but rather this reflects the fact, this is sort of letting us know, right, that actually Saul has been rejected as king. This word regret is used in another important place, and that's Genesis 6:6. Remember where we get the story of the beginning of the flood? And God looks at his creation which has like been taken over with violence because of human sin, right? And God says that he actually regrets creating. Once again, right, the point here isn't, right, that God is like surprised by what's happening, right? It's not like God's looking at his creation and goes, good heavens, what have they done? Rather, what we're being told here is now that God rejects what's happening. He's rejecting the actions of human beings, and he's also rejecting Saul's actions here as well. It's also interesting to know what Samuel's reaction to all this is. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. Samuel is angry over Saul being rejected, and basically cries to the Lord all night, I guess, with the intent of trying to persuade God to change his mind. That is, this tells you something right about Samuel and his relationship to Saul. We've seen all along that the relationship between these two men is not what you would call sort of like a buddy-buddy relationship. It's a relationship of a person who holds one office, prophet, with a relation with a person who holds another office, king, Samuel and Saul. But we also have a sense here, right, that this is not in keeping with Samuel's own desires. That's not going to change anything, but we just have a notation here that Samuel doesn't like what's happening. So notice what happens in 15:12. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning, and it was told Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself and turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal. So here's another thing. Not only does Saul not do what he was told, he doesn't carry out Harem, he also erects a monument to himself commemorating his great victory, quote unquote. Right? That is, A, he doesn't do what he's told, and then B, now he set up a monument to sort of, advertise the great victory, quote unquote, that he's won. So obviously things are really off here. And then he goes to Gilgal. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. That is, Saul now comes to Samuel and says, mission accomplished. Amalekites wiped out. I did what I was told. And by the way, I've just erected a statue to myself over there. It's a great equestrian statue with me on a horse, and it's a really great thing. And then Samuel says in 15:14, what is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen that I hear? Wait. Weren't you told to get rid of all the livestock too? What's all the bah that I hear? Where is this coming from? And then that's when Samuel says, well, obviously, right, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. Then Samuel said to Saul, stop, I will tell you what the Lord said to me this night. And he said to him, let him speak. That is, notice what Saul says here. This is 15:15. Saul said, they have brought them up from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord our God, and the rest we devoted to destruction. And that's when, basically Samuel looks at Saul and says, liar, liar, pants on fire. That is, Saul's just told two lies. He says, lie number one, the people spared them. The people spared them, right? I'm totally innocent. I had nothing to do with this. I'm just a king. I was standing there celebrating my victory, and lo and behold, right, these people started taking all this livestock they weren't supposed to take, and what could I do about it? Well, that's not true. And second of all, right, then he says, well, and by the way, The reason why they took the animals was because we're going to offer them as sacrifices to the Lord our God. When we've been told what? The only animals that were killed were like the worst ones. That is, this is like he's been disobedient, now he's lying to cover it up. And we've kind of seen this before, right? We've seen this before in Genesis 3, the story of the Garden of Eden. Okay? Did you eat the fruit that I told you not to eat? To which Adam says, it's her fault. That is, one of the things we're seeing here, and I think it's really important is, and I think, Deuteronomy really emphasizes, 1 Samuel emphasizes too, right? One of the problems here, right, is that the turning aside from the following of the commandments of the Lord, right, leads to other things. It's not only an act of disobedience, it leads to sort of a mindset of disobedience, right? Where we avoid responsibility for what we've actually chosen to do. And we can sort of like invent all sorts of creative stories or all sorts of rationalizations why we did what we did even though it was wrong. And that's what Saul the king does here. Samuel's holding him accountable for what he's done. Now look what happens in 15:17 and following. This is 15:17, actually to 31, but we may not get that far. And Samuel said, though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. That's what he was told to do. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me, and I have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, back, and I have devoted the Amalekites to destruction. But the people took the spoil. There they are again, right? The people, those awful people, they took the spoil, sheep and oxen, and the best of the things, and devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. And Samuel said, and this is really important, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. Let's take a look at that. Now, notice what Samuel says to Saul, right? And we just want to have a sense here, right? We want to avoid the idea that, prophets are like heartless people who really secretly enjoy telling people bad things. It's kind of like, we probably all know people like this, right? They come to tell you something bad, about you, and they say to you, I'm really sorry to say this when they're not. I'm really sorry to say this, but, and they're really actually happy that they're telling you bad news. We get the sense here, right? That Samuel is really grief-stricken about what he has to say to Saul. But notice what he does say. Though you are little in your own eyes. And we get a hint, right, that may be one of Saul's problems. Remember when we first find out that Saul's been anointed king, and there's calling a rallying of Israel around for them to meet him, and they can't find Saul. Remember where he is? Hiding in the baggage. Samuel says, look, you may be little in your own eyes, but the Lord has made you head over his people Israel. That is, that's what Samuel's saying. The Lord has put you in a position of responsibility to his people. And you have refused to exercise that responsibility for whatever reason. And that's bad. The Lord anointed you king over Israel. The Lord sent you on a mission. And then he spells out what that mission is. And then once again, Saul repeats his own lie. Oh, well, I did it. I carried out the mission. I mean, I whole 9 yards, right? I had everything written carefully down, and I'll, here are the boxes, all checked off. Melechite's gone, check. King Agag, taken prisoner, check, 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 it's all done. And, by the way, the people seized all the best animals for the purpose of sacrificing to the Lord, of course. And that's when Samuel says, well, the Lord doesn't take great delight simply in sacrifice. The sacrifice that he really wants is the sacrifice of obedience. Now, I think this is a really important point, and this is where we'll have to stop, but I want to dwell on it for just a minute, because it is so important. This idea of obedience being a form of sacrifice, I think, is really a really important point. And we'll just want to kind of think about a really significant New Testament example of this. It's Hebrews 9, which is a description of Christ's sacrifice of himself. And the idea here is this, that Christ's sacrifice, right, isn't just simply that he dies on the cross. I mean, if there was evidence, right, that Jesus was dragged kicking and screaming to the cross, that would basically explode Christianity, right? You got the wrong man. No, it was somebody else. He's dragged to the cross. The thing that Hebrews is emphasizing, right, is that Christ's sacrifice was his complete, total obedience toward God. That was his sacrifice. That's the sacrifice that God desires. Not just simply sort of like doing this or that. Remember when we were back in Leviticus? I think we were back in Leviticus, I think sometime during like the first Reagan administration. Remember I said that one of the meanings of the burnt offering, right? Remember this is the offering where you take the animal, you put it on the altar, and it's totally combusted. Remember we learned there, right, that the burnt offering is a symbol, a sign of one's total offering of oneself to God, right? That's the offering that Jesus completely and perfectly lives out. His whole life becomes one long act of obedience toward his mission to the Father. His perfect fidelity to the mission that God has sent him on. And that's the point that Samuel's making here. Samuel is saying, look, A, right, you actually didn't do what God told you to do. But B, God isn't simply interested in us simply sort of like following every rule that we've been given. What he actually wants from us is nothing less than ourselves. He wants the sort of total surrender of ourselves over to him. That's what obedience and that's what faithfulness look like. Anything else, Samuel says correctly, right, is rebellion. Now, I just want to emphasize that point once again by going back to Genesis 3, and that's where we'll stop. Remember that by the point that we get to the episode with when the man and the woman are tempted to eat the fruit in the tree in the middle of the garden, remember, we've been told a number of really important things. We've been told, right, that they were given the garden and everything in it. It's beautiful to look at. It provides them with food. It provides them with meaningful work. Then God's given them one another, right, so they're not alone and all that kind of stuff. And then the temptation, right? Is it true that God told you that you couldn't eat of any fruit of the tree of the garden? Well, no, that's not correct. He told us we could eat any fruit, but the one in the middle of the garden. Why do you suppose he doesn't want to eat you? Why do you suppose he doesn't want you to eat of the tree in the middle of the garden? I'll tell you why. He knows darn well that once you eat of that fruit, you'll be just like him. And he won't have anyone to boss around anymore. So go ahead and eat the fruit. Notice what's going on there. It is temptation, but notice what it also is, right? The man and the woman are being asked to ignore and overlook everything that God has given them and to focus on the one thing that's been withheld for reasons that they don't know yet. There might be actually a very good reason why that fruit hasn't been given to them, right? C.S. Lewis uses the image, right, of a children's playground, which is sort of like located on sort of like the edge of a steep slope, and a fence has been put in, right? The fence limits the freedom of the children to fall over the edge of the slope, right? It does. It limits their freedom to kill themselves. But that's kind of like a good freedom not to have, right? It's a protection, a hedging of human action. That's what they're called, to overlook. And I think that's very, very much what Samuel's doing here. Look, God has made you king over his people. He's entrusted you with the stewardship of the people that he's called to himself. You chose to ignore all that and to do something that you thought was good merely in the moment. Someone who thinks like that cannot be king. Goodbye. Now, I think there's something else going on too here that we'll just want to note, and this is kind of, once again, looking forward to the New Testament. As people note, right, the further on you get into 1st and 2nd Kings, certainly after Solomon, and then, all the kings that you find in 2nd Kings, right, it becomes sort of like almost like a monotonous liturgy, right? So-and-so became king, and he did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And then so-and-so became king, and he did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so-and-so became king, and he too did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, da-da-da-da. I think that the two books of Kings, right, their aim is not to be depressing, but actually to make a positive point. And that positive point is this, that in the final analysis, no human being is capable of being king over God's people. That's an office that no human being can fill. There's only one person who can fill that office. And he enacted the perfect act of obedience on the cross. That's the positive point there. Well, we'll finish 1 Samuel 15 next Sunday. We'll see what happens. What's going to happen is we're going to see this interesting drama of this kind of struggle between David and Saul. Saul is going to consistently misread David's intentions and also steadily, in effect, go basically out of his mind. So it's going to be a warning about the dangers of both jealousy and paranoia that we'll see. And then finally, of course, Saul will die in battle rather than be captured by the Philistines. And then David will become king. But we'll get to that when we get to it.